Alrighty, so welcome to our class. Let's talk about Scotland. This is kind of for our travel group, but anybody else who's interested to learn more about Scotland, the key places we're going. In 2 weeks, we're going to learn more about Ireland. The focus on that one is going to be more about kind of the history that led up to the Troubles, how they started to get solved, and its aftermath. We'll talk about some of the places we'll go to, but not as in-depth a detail. For this class, if you ever want to ask a question, you can interrupt me, raise your hand. I'll also try to sometimes, at different places, share some tidbits of information or advice for some of the free time we have in Scotland. We have sometimes afternoons free, mornings, some of the highlights that you might choose to go and do during that free time. So we will start in Edinburgh. Edinburgh. So it lies east coast of Scotland on the Firth of Forth. So Edinburgh is defined by the old town and the new town. The new town's still pretty old, but it's old and new town. So that Magnificent Mile, Royal Mile kind of thing is an old town. It goes from Edinburgh Castle up here down to St. Giles, all the way down to Holyrood Palace. During our first full day in Edinburgh, you'll be visiting the castle, and then you have free time. So if you really like kind of royal palaces, castles, Holyrood's an interesting place to go. That's where the king or the queen would stay when they are visiting in Edinburgh. So you'll see Edinburgh Castle's built on this large rock up here. That goes back way far. Someone's always been having some kind of fort, dun fort, hill fort, giant castle on that rock. It's leftover magma pipe that kind of got hardened, so it's overlooking the city. So Edinburgh has been the capital of Scotland since 1437, when it replaced Scone, the town, and not the delicious baked good. Now, when you go to Scotland and Ireland, get some scones there. They're not going to be the weird triangle things you get at Starbucks. Those aren't scones. Those are triangle muffins. Scones are better. You can get it with clotted cream, a little lemon curd. I like their black currant jelly. Get as much black currant stuff as you can. It's delicious. That's a side note, but it's good. So, Scottish Parliament resides in Edinburgh. However, in the past, Edinburgh Castle was often under English control. Sometimes people fought about it among the Scots themselves. As Courtney mentioned last week, Queen Mary might be holding up there her supporters, and then there's a big siege. We'll get to that later. So, Edinburgh Castle. Oop. There's the castle. We'll go there. It's a tourist attraction. It's museum. Also, it's still used in part by the military as well. Of the castles we'll visit, Stirling Castle, I prefer it to Edinburgh. It's a little bit smaller, but I think it has more interesting history to it. It's a cooler looking castle, but this one's pretty cool. It goes maybe up there. So here's a little video on it.
Once a military stronghold, Edinburgh Castle is one of the oldest royal castles in the United Kingdom. So much Scottish history happened right here, from the birth of kings to the famous battles that determined the fate of a nation. Edinburgh Castle is perched upon Castle Rock, which is the remains of a volcano that formed over 350 million years ago. There are a number of ways to experience the castle. You can explore on your own, join a scheduled tour, or grab an audio guide and hear all the facts. You can see so much of Edinburgh from up here. So there's the Prince's Gardens, the Central Station, Waverley train station, you have Scott Monument, and in the distance, Arthur's Seat. We've come to Crown Square. This is where you'll find the Great Hall, the Royal Apartments, and the Scottish Crown Jewels. Inside the Royal Palace, you'll find plenty of grandeur. It's home to the Scottish Crown Jewels and the Stone of Destiny, used for centuries in the coronation of Scottish kings. Be sure to check out the Great Hall, built for King James IV and used as a meeting place for the Scottish Parliament until 1639. This is Maud's Mag, the world's most famous medieval gun. She could fire a 150-kilo stone up to 2 miles. How did they get this into there? From rebels to royals, it's astounding to think what Edinburgh Castle has seen through the ages. This is an essential stop on any visit to Edinburgh.
All right, so that's Edinburgh Castle. We'll visit there. You can see the royal jewels. There's a really nice tea shop in there. You can get a shortbread in the shape of a giant Scotty dog. It's delicious. Victoria sponge cake, all those good things. They always shoot a gun off at 1 o'clock. Why do you think they shoot it off at 1 instead of noon?
They use less gunpowder.
Yeah, use this gunpowder. Scots are frugal. Spend a way lot less money shooting off 1 than 12. So there you go. But if you're around, you can gather, watch them. Historically, it helps the ships in the harbor and docks to set their clocks by 1 o'clock. So King David first constructed some of the more impressive and formidable buildings we see today in 1130. The chapel that you see here is dedicated to his mother, and it's the oldest part of Queen Margaret still standing in oldest building hall of Edinburgh or the castle itself. So it's a really cool chapel. Sometimes tours don't actually take you inside of it, but definitely take time to go inside. It's kind of a cool place. The first to capture the castle from the Scots was Edward I after a 3-day siege in 1296. But then after the king's death in 1307, the English stronghold was weakened, and Sir Thomas Randolph, the Earl of Moray, acting on behalf of Robert the Bruce, reclaimed it in 1314. We'll have another Earl of Moray come into things later. I think it's a cool name, Earl of Moray. I wish I was the Earl of Moray. David's Tower, built in 1370 by David II, Robert the Bruce's son, who returned to Scotland after 10 years of captivity in England, was built as part of the reconstruction of the castle. So it kind of got destroyed in the Lang Siege or the Long Siege that we'll kind of get to in a little bit here. That siege was a result of the extremely confusing Marian Civil War, when the dispute was over whether Scotland's monarch ought to be Queen James or King James I, later the Sixth, spoiler alert. Since James was only a year old when the war began, Mary was first imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle, and then a whole big stuff that Courtney talked about last week, between Mary being in France and coming back, and people getting mad, and who's going to be the king, and we don't want a Catholic, we don't want a Protestant, all of that. The divisions were both political and religious, with the Queen's men made up mostly of the Catholic nobility supporting the exiled Mary, and King's men forming the Protestant government supporting the regency of James. The Earl of Moray, a different earl, having convincingly defeated the majority of Mary's forces early on in the war, managed to bring Scotland largely under his control by 1570. He ruled from Edinburgh Castle.
And he's Mary's half-brother.
He's Mary's half-brother. Everybody's related, as we talked about last week. So, if you want to learn more about that history, you can read it here. It gets kind of complicated with the siege and all of that. But eventually, John Knox comes into it, and when we see in John Knox's house. So if you want to learn more about that history of that whole Civil War kind of thing going on, you can watch the Issues class from last week, read more of this, ask Courtney. So there is our friend John Knox. They loved long beards back then. So John Knox, often considered the kind of father of Presbyterianism. He was played by one of my favorite actors in a newer version of Mary Queen of Scots. And it's kind of, I don't know what it says that the main character in a big movie is the bad guy, is like the founder of our church. Because he's the bad guy in most of the stories. Take that as it is.
He's the bad guy.
He's bad. So he was a leader of the reforming party in Scotland. So he studied with John Calvin in Geneva, took a lot of Calvin's teachings back home to Scotland. So the Presbyterian Church basically traces his ancestry primarily to Knox in Scotland and to England, and so he's often kind of considered the founder of Presbyterianism. He advocated violent revolution. He was considered one of the most powerful preachers of his day, but only 2 of the hundreds of sermons he preached were ever published. He is a key figure in the formation of modern Scotland, yet there was only one monument erected to him in Scotland, and his grave lies beneath a parking lot. So take that as you will. But a lot of graves are under parking lots in England. They dug up one of the old kings, which was the Hunchback. Yeah, under a parking lot. So if you dig there, you're probably going to find some graves and maybe some famous people, and then you won't be able to build the house you want to build there anymore. So it's kind of like we think of Calvin so key to Presbyterianism. We actually don't have anything written by Calvin as any part of our governing documents. We kind of look to his books, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, but none of the confessions he wrote made it into the Book of Confessions, where we do have some stuff that Knox helped on. So we'll skip here away from his long beard. There's him preaching, probably yelling at people most likely. He did a lot of that. So he's educated in Glasgow, possibly at St. Andrews. Shortly after Queen Mary Tudor's ascension to the throne, he fled to Geneva. That's where he met Calvin. Then in 1553, the Roman Catholic Mary I became queen. So Knox was now in danger, so he left for Europe at that point. He became a minister in Frankfurt in Germany, and then in Geneva, Switzerland. In between, he returned to Scotland to get married and to preach, and was surprised at how far the teaching of the Reformers, his little group, was spreading. So eventually he returned to Scotland in 1559. After more than a decade abroad, he became a minister in Edinburgh, and soon after the acknowledged leader of the reforming party in the kirk, or the church. So they called churches kirks. So St. Giles is a cathedral, not really though anymore because it's Protestant, so it's really the High Kirk of Scotland, but they like the name cathedral, more people know what it means, so they kind of keep it on their signs, even though technically it's not a cathedral. So they obviously don't dislike Catholicism so much that they want to keep its fancy name. There you go. So 1560 was the key year in the First Scottish Reformation. The Scottish Parliament passed laws getting rid of the Mass and the Pope's power in Scotland. Knox and 5 other men, all called John, wrote important documents such as the Scots Confession of Faith, which is in our Book of Confessions, which explained what the church believed. In the summer, Knox became minister in Edinburgh. In December, the first General Assembly met in Edinburgh. It was said after his death that Knox was a man who neither feared nor flattered anyone alive. Scotland would have had a Reformation without him, but it was from him that it received much of its distinctive character and direction. So the John Knox house that we'll visit is on that Royal Mile. There it is. It dates back to 1470, which makes it and Mowbray House attached, the oldest original medieval building surviving on that Royal Mile in Edinburgh. So he didn't stay there too long. It's kind of like, when George Washington in America had dinner someplace. It's now called the George Washington Tavern. He may have slept here once. So he stayed there for probably a couple months. It wasn't like his house that he owned. He just kind of stayed there, but it's an old house, and they wanted something, because he would preach over at St. Giles, which is basically right across the street from the house. The good thing about the house going in, it's also like a museum of kind of storytelling at the bottom level, but you can go through and it gives you a lot of kind of the history of Knox and his kind of battle with the Catholics, with Queen Mary. He was part of this siege of St. Andrew's Castle. He was taken prisoner on a boat by the French, was forced to row. Somehow they let him go and he escaped, questionable. He ends up in England for a while. He actually helps write the Book of Common Prayer for the Church of England, but then he hates that and rails against it, so I don't know what's going on there. He didn't like all his own work, I guess. He goes back to Scotland. It's a really kind of interesting history, so you can learn more about that at the John Knox house, and you can read little kind of snippets of some of his writings. But one of the kind of key things for Knox was he believed that at times it is perfectly right, even commanded, to take up sword and take down tyrants and all of that. It often becomes the critical thing of how do you define a tyrant? because you can kind of twist that however you want. In our American Revolution, we called George a tyrant. Was he really a tyrant? Probably not. But you can make that clear, because again, they're following back to the old Presbyterian heritage. A lot of them are Presbyterian, of John Knox saying, hey, this Queen's Catholic, obviously horrible, we should probably kill her. God wants us to even. It's perfectly okay. And so you have that history in Presbyterian thought of, we don't like this government, we can revolt against it. You often even have that in the American Civil War, because a lot of the leaders of that were also, guess what? Presbyterians, because they came in through Pennsylvania, went down the old wagon road, which is I-81 now, and would settle in Appalachia and South Carolina, North Carolina. So all of them also had that heritage and would say, hey, just like the American Revolution, this government isn't acting in our best interest. They're not legitimate. They're wrong. We have every right to take up arms against them. Yes, Courtney.
Yeah, so I was just going to note,
Do you want a microphone?
can you hear me? I'm sorry, my voice
Probably
is...
not. Where it is.
What?
Where it is. Just speak into it.
Okay, can you hear me?
No,
No.
not the box, the little microphone.
Sorry. Okay, can
You
you
have
hear
to
me?
turn it on.
I'm very bad at this, apparently.
There you go.
Okay, sorry.
The mic.
I told Sue I wasn't going to need this, but then I should have known I was going to have to interrupt Stephen.
Happens.
So, sorry for our technical difficulty. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Those old commercials. So yeah, I was just going to note that I don't think you really get the American Revolution without John Knox and without the Scottish Reformation and all of the ideas that they espoused. And just because Stephen brought the Civil War into it, I wanted to also say that I know Pennsylvania was technically a Union state, but right here we are very, very close to, I think, are we north of the Mason-Dixon line?
Yes.
Okay.
That's
I was
fair.
like, well, yeah, because like part of New Jersey is below. It wasn't as clear cut even during the Civil War as you might think. You know, it wasn't like, oh, everybody in these states is one way, everybody in these states is another way. Certainly, you know, you have the issue of slavery, definitely the number one big one, but not the only one that was called up at the time, and with a lot of people still having concern about overreach of the federal government, and a lot of concern about, well, if you're calling enslaved people property and the federal government is saying it can take property, what's that slippery slope? How far does that go? And you still have, in this area, many folks who are, you know, it hasn't even been really 100 years since the revolution at that time, who are still concerned about these issues of government overreach and of feeling like they want to.
If you want to learn more about that, there's a good book called, she's read it, Born Fighting, by Jim Webb.
Yeah.
That kind of traces this kind of Scots-Irish Presbyterian, just you're always fighting with someone. You never quite trust anyone. It even goes into,
that's a big part of it.
you read Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. Some of the same thing is coming up, all the way from John Knox and the Scottish Reformation. It filters into our revolution, to the Civil War, and even to the political fighting we have today.
I mean,
through all Appalachian. It's John Knox's.
I would argue that it makes its way even to January 6th, and as
So it's all tied in. To understand today, you understand kind of what started it. So John Knox's house, kind of tradition holds he was there in the months between his return to Edinburgh in August and his death in November of 1572. Despite being aged almost 60 and very ill, he continued to preach at St. Giles. You can see a little statue of him at St. Giles Cathedral with his long beard. You can get selfies with it, all that kind of good stuff. Any questions on Knox? That's a whole history of a life in like 10 minutes, but you can learn a lot more about him. But he has some good stuff, he has some bad stuff, like most people. As Courtney always says, and I always talk about, history is a mixture of people who do good and do bad, who often have a lot of choices, all of them which are bad. And you can't completely erase the good because of the bad, and you can't erase the bad because of the good. It's all kind of tied up in there. For those going to St. Andrews to play golf, if you have a little bit of time, you can visit St. Andrews Castle, and you'll hear a lot more about this kind of story involving John Knox there too. Next is St. Giles Cathedral. Technically, a cathedral is the seat of a bishop. Today, part of the Church of Scotland, they have no bishops, so it's a historic cathedral, but not a current one. So sometimes you'll hear it as the High Kirk of Edinburgh, sometimes St. Giles Cathedral. The church is quite happy, though, to style itself as a cathedral, as evidenced by the signs outside. So St. Giles himself was a hermit in the 6th century, living in modern-day France. He was a great animal lover, believed the souls of animals were equal to humans. According to legend, one day he came across a hunting party led by King Wamba of the Visigoths. Wamba shot an arrow at a deer, but Giles leapt up and plucked the arrow out of the air. Wamba was so impressed that he converted to Christianity. Giles is the patron saint of beggars, lepers, and Edinburgh. So, don't know how that... A lot of beggars and lepers.
It should be lepers, not lepers.
There you go, lepers. I like that. We should probably work that into a puppet sketch of some kind on St. Giles. So remember, up until 1560, Scotland was a Catholic country and St. Giles was a Catholic church. But the Scottish Reformation, the movement which converted Scotland to Presbyterianism, caused a seismic change, and you start seeing these changes in churches. So St. Giles, one of the main church's pulpits that was used to attack the Queen and Catholicism. Just like even today, certain churches attack certain political leaders, certain things. Vietnam War, certain churches were big on that. Riverside in New York used that pulpit for pacifism, so you still see that trend today. You can read more about it in the thing, but here's a short...
The Grand St. Giles Cathedral is the historic city church of Edinburgh. It sits on the Royal Mile between Edinburgh Castle and the Palace of Holyrood House, and its crown spire, completed in 1495, is one of the city's most iconic sites. Also known as the High Kirk of Edinburgh, it's the mother church of Presbyterianism and contains the quite stunning chapel of the Order of the Thistle, built for the knights of the same name, headed by the Queen. The ornate and highly detailed interior of the chapel, from its Gothic stalls to its vaulted ceiling, is really something to behold.
The church was built in 1124. It was a Catholic church, and that all changed at the Reformation in the 16th century. And in 1560, John Knox preached here. The stained glass windows are really interesting because none of these windows date back further than the 19th century. You know, it's a 12th century church, but anything pertaining to Catholic Church was removed in the 16th century. So that's why you get the 19th century windows.
To the east side of St. Giles stands a newer version of the original 12th century Market Cross, a former meeting point for traders and merchants, and a handy spot from where royal proclamations would be read. These days, St. Giles continues to be an active place of worship and features a choir and live music schedule. There's also a cafe situated below the cathedral.
Gotta have a cafe.
St. Giles is free to enter, although donations are much appreciated. Up-to-date visitor information.
So you got the Adam Smith statue up there as well. Scotland, invisible hand of the free market economy, all that good stuff. So one of the interesting things is St. Giles, going back to all this history. So remember in 1603, Elizabeth I of England died childless, so James VI of Scotland became James I of England. As a result, he also became head of the Church of England, but not the Church of Scotland, because who was the head and is the head of the Church of Scotland?
Jesus Christ.
Exactly. So James's son, Charles I, attempted to change this. In an attempt to bring the Church of Scotland into line with Anglican traditions, he appointed bishops and introduced a common prayer book. On July 23rd, 1637, when the newly appointed Bishop of Edinburgh was reading from the Common Prayer Book, a lady called Jenny Geddes is said to have thrown her stool at the bishop, a wooden stool, to avoid any confusion. I can see it happening either way. So this sparked a full-scale riot. As a result of this unrest, the Presbyterians causing trouble, throwing stools at people. So in 1638, the National Covenant was drafted at nearby Greyfriars Kirk. This was effectively a hard-nosed letter. They liked to write strongly worded letters to Charles I, telling him to defend and respect the church instead of interfering with it. Copies were distributed to every church in Scotland, and close to 2/3 of the Scottish population ultimately signed it. They're known as Covenanters. Courtney talked about this last week. Instead of agreeing to the terms of the covenant, Charles decided to fight. He asked the English Parliament to raise an army, but Parliament refused. Charles then declared war on Parliament. What follows is often called the English Civil War, but it's more correctly known as the War of the Three Kingdoms because there was fighting in Scotland and Ireland too. Indeed, it all started in Scotland because a Presbyterian woman, part of the PW group, threw a stool at the bishop. So one incident at St. Giles kind of really helped lead to this whole big thing we know as the English Civil War.
Maybe.
But this is the story we like to tell, Courtney. As with all history, yeah, maybe. Stories have probably some truth to them, but it also probably gets enlarged over time.
There's
as
a
well.
good bit of debate over whether that actually, the stool throwing incident actually happened.
It
Well, I
happens.
like it.
We like to think of one of the ladies of the church throwing a stool, though.
Well, don't give them any ideas, Stephen.
Get one right Alright, so there's St. Giles and Adam Smith. So we're gonna have worship in St. Giles at the early service on our Sunday there in Scotland. From there we go to Stirling Castle. So the 8 o'clock service is a much more kind of simple service, sitting in chairs. They always have communion with the giant goblet you all drink out of. Pass on that myself. And then you drink the whole cup thing and you pass your germs around. They still do it that way. Just, yeah, even after COVID, they still do it that way. They just like to warn people if you don't want to do that, you can kind of like pass or just step aside to the back.
You can dip.
You can dip too, but there's peer pressure to drink. So I want you to know that that's what typically happens so you're not caught off guard. So from there we drive up to Stirling. We should pass one of our favorite sites in Scotland, which is the Kelpies. The Kelpies are the two horse heads that you see. In theory, you just see the giant metal horse heads coming out of the water, because Kelpies are water horses that will come and drag your children to the bottom of the loch and eat them. But if you have a piece of metal, you can ward them off. But the Kelpies are these giant metal horse heads. They're gorgeous. I hope we can convince the bus driver to let's stop in the park and get out and kind of see them. They're kind of built around these canals where some of the longboats go on their journeys throughout Scotland and everything. You can even climb up to the top of the Kelpies, and there's also a tea room there to get a snack and tea.
And a gift shop.
And a gift shop, where I have many things. So next up is Stirling Castle. So Stirling Castle has been likened to a huge brooch clasping highlands and lowlands together. Technically, often you consider the highlands north of Inverness, of Loch Ness. But between Stirling Castle and Inverness, there's not a lot of stuff there. So often Stirling Castle is kind of seen as this kind of gateway into the Highlands area. It was first mentioned around 1110, and many royal dramas unfolded there. Until the Union of the Crowns in 1603, almost every Scottish monarch had either lived in the castle or been crowned here or died here. There's some exceptions. So Stirling has some really old parts, some new parts. It's one of kind of my favorite castles in Scotland. You can kind of read through this later, but there's some really interesting history that happens here. That's a good shot of it from down below. You can see the Wallace Monument from there. We won't actually be going to the Wallace Monument, but you can kind of see it from Stirling Castle. So Robert the Bruce, they have his siege of Stirling Castle there, all this kind of fun stuff. You go in, it has a chapel area, a great hall. They also have a really good tea room there, and count them, two really good gift shops. So as you're thinking about where you want to get your gifts along this trip, there's gift shops everywhere you go. And typically, to get out, you have to exit through the gift shop. I like this kind of like elderberry liqueur you can get there. You can pour it over ice cream, and it's really good. So I haven't been able to find it anywhere else. So there you go, get it there. So there's the Wallace Monument. We're not going to go there, but in the Victorian era, there was an increased interest in Scotland's past, all because of
George the. Hang on. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Do you want me to talk about George the
No.
Fourth?
I was going to have
I'm
you
going
name
to talk
the name.
about him though.
Oh.
I'm going to talk about him though.
I was going to have you say Sir Walter Raleigh.
Oh.
No, it's George Scott.
Well, it wasn't Sir Walter Raleigh.
Walter Scott.
So Sir Walter Scott, are you familiar with him and his Ivanhoe? He really invented the genre of historical fiction, wrote a series of books, the Waverley novels, about the Jacobite revolutions. You may have heard 1745. Any Outlander fans in here? Yeah. So, yeah, 1745, the final Jacobite revolution happens where they're still trying to put the Stuarts back on the throne. So later in the early 19th century, this all gets really romanticized and really turned into all of these stories, which again may or may not be true, but we like to enjoy them and think of them as true. So Sir Walter Scott is the great, storyteller of Scotland in the early 19th century, and so the Waverley novels tell us all about that. But then also George the Fourth, the son of George the Third, becomes really interested and fascinated with Scotland and continues right down to this day with the British monarchs being really into Scotland. And he really popularizes all of the kilts and tartans and bagpipes and clans and all that. And a lot of that gets made up, pretty invented, right? Or at least the way we think of it gets invented right at that time. So it's something you see happen a lot. Remember the Highlanders, as we call them, were tribal. So they're very, very different from the folks who were at Stirling Castle. Even later on, like Mary Queen of Scots was not necessarily like, she would not have considered herself necessarily queen of that.
They're like the wildlings north of the wall.
Yeah, exactly. They're like north of the wall. Exactly. So that's something we see happen a lot in history. It happens with pirates. It happens with Native American peoples in this country, where once a threat has been eliminated, it becomes romanticized, and we tell all these wild, fun stories.
It's like Vikings now are
Vikings.
cool, but
Yeah.
like they raped, pillaged, and burned everything. But now they're like fun.
And pirates as
Pirates
well.
are fun.
I mean,
But so like yeah.
George the Fourth and Sir Walter Scott, the two figures who really give us that really romanticized view of the Highlands, and the Jacobites, who again were not really necessarily fighting so much for Scotland's freedom, or however you might think of that, but were more fighting. It's almost always this conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics, and the Highlanders were Catholic for the most part, and the Stuarts were Catholic, and the Stuarts had never really been exactly like in charge of the Highlands, but they were Catholic. So the Jacobites.
So this Catholic Protestant thing has
It's a Catholic Protestant
things in
thing.
Scotland, and as we'll see in 2 weeks, major things in Northern Ireland too. So we won't actually go to the Wallace Monument. Really, all you do there, you climb up a lot of steps. I had to carry Verity up all the steps, so I only got like a thigh workout doing that. There's a couple of museum pieces there. Then you get to the top, you have a really nice view. But it's cool to see from Stirling Castle. So from Stirling, we go to Oban on the city. So Oban itself isn't all that historically interesting, no offense, Oban. But they have this thing called McKegg's Folly, on it. So it looks like a really old piece, but it's a folly, meaning it was created in more modern times to look old. But you'll see that from the harbor as we take a ferry out to Iona. So that's a really kind of cool sea town. Really good views as you take the ferry out to Oban. Now, as you get into to Mole, you'll pass the Duart Castle, which is kind of cool castle. We won't go there. I forgot somebody from the church in that kind of like their clan's place. They said we should wave to it. But you know. So Iona, we're not going to spend a lot of time here on Iona. I'll be talking about that a lot in some upcoming sermons and on April 7th. But this is the new kind of chapel of Iona. The smaller armed cross here is original from 8th century. This one is a replica. The original pieces are housed in a museum that you can go and see there. There are a couple like original type footings of buildings from way back in Columbus Day, but there's not much left from that time. And some of this also kind of storage. You can see some old pathway stones. Iona was kind of restarted in the 20th century by a guy named George MacLeod as kind of a different way of being a church and trying to draw on some of the old kind of Celtic spirituality things, but getting away from such the order and hierarchy of our regular churches. So we'll take a ferry from Oban to Mole. There's a really cool shack near the ferry where you can get a cup of crab meat for a little snack. It's good stuff, cup of crab. Then you take it across, you drive a bus down these one-lane roads across Mole. So Mole has like only one-lane roads, and this has a little pull-off. So you see somebody else coming a mile ahead of you because it's wide open. Whoever gets the side of the road that's there, pull-offs on, you just kind of pull off and over. It's hard when the big coaches will be on come through sometimes though, but often you kind of go fast. You get good at it after a while, just kind of whoop around each other real quick. At first I was a little nervous, and then I got the hang of it. From Mole, you drive across Mole, beautiful scenery on Mole. Just sometimes these little tiny locks surrounded by mountains you drive past, lots of sheep. The sheep will walk in the road. You better not hit a sheep or you get in big trouble. Then we go to Fionfort, which you take another little ferry across to the Isle of Iona. You can often see kind of seals and things swimming around. Really beautiful water and beaches there. So we'll get to go to Iona, kind of tour this new area, and you can walk into some of the historic sites as well. Now, if you go to Iona on St. Columba's Saint Day, you get a get out of purgatory free pass. But unfortunately, that's in June. Sorry. We went in June, and we took a picture of the sign to prove it with the date stamp on our cell phone. In case there is a purgatory, I don't think there is, but hedging my bets, I got it on my phone. I don't have to stay.
I'm taking that with you.
There you go. We've noticed we've been using a lot of the liturgy from the Iona community in worship here during Lent. Any questions on Iona or Mole? We don't get to spend a lot of time on Mole. It's basically drive across the island, go to Iona, get back on the island, drive across the island, take the ferry, get back to Oban. But it's really kind of beautiful scenery. There's a really cool town north of Mole that has like all the painted houses and everything. We won't go to there because it's to the north, but you can picture it in your mind. All right, so then from Oban we drive to Glasgow, but we stop in, this is a little thing on Iona.
If you were looking out this window as I am, you'd see that this is a very grey day. But had you been here 2 days ago when there was a pilgrimage round the island and the sun was out in all its magnificence, then it was turquoise blue. That was the colour of the water, because the sea there has white underneath it, which on a good day reflects the blue of the sky. So people come here sometimes just because it's a very beautiful place. There's nothing between us and America apart from the Atlantic Ocean. But other people come here because it's a place where a major evangelism campaign began when in 563 St. Columba came from Ireland to begin his mission to the Scots on Iona. And he developed a form of mission whereby sending monks out 2 by 2 to befriend people before they evangelised. Through this method, much of Scotland was won for Christ. And the mode of evangelism, the method of evangelism, was copied back in Ireland, where Columba came from, and down into missions in England, and also copied by one of his successors as a missionary monk, Columbanus, who took the gospel from Britain, the British Islands, into Europe, as far away possibly as Prague and maybe up even into the Ukraine. So it's a place which in the 6th century was a centre of missionary outreach. And through the ages, from the 5th to the 15th century or 16th century, it suffered. The Celtic Church gradually faded away. The Benedictines came. They were attacked several times by the Norsemen, the Vikings from Norway and Sweden. And at the Reformation, the whole place, the Abbey, which had been a magnificent building in the 15th century, was desecrated. It was ruined, pulled down, and the houses in the village were built from the stones of the Abbey. The landlord rebuilt it at the end of the 19th century, at least the cathedral part, the small cathedral, and the community of which I'm a member began to rebuild the monastic buildings where people eat, live, sleep, talk, walk in 1938. And since 1938, this place has become a place of pilgrimage for people coming not just to a historic site, but to plug into a prophetic community, which is sometimes in the centre of the church and sometimes on the fringe of the church, but which has pioneered in Scotland work with regard to ecumenism, social justice, healing, reconciliation, and the project which I'm working on, which is the renewal of worship in our churches. So people come here for a number of reasons. Some people are very disturbed when they arrive and they find there are no monks running about in cowls in among the ruins, but there are children playing, there are people, white people singing South African freedom songs, there are people doing Bible study who are laughing, and there's worship which, though this week, for example, predominantly led by Presbyterians, allows for a degree of colourfulness and expression which is pretty rare in this part of the world.
We walk his
It's just
way.
shocking.
We
Colorful worship led by Presbyterians. So the speaker was John Bell. He's one of the leaders of the Iona community. He has a lot of hymns in our hymn book, so that response we're singing right now after the prayer confession, that's one of John Bell's hymns. And he talks about something that we heard in the St. Giles video too, of during the Scottish Reformation, just destroying everything Catholic. Any of the windows, the chapels, the cathedral, so you don't get this history saved and preserved, which kind of goes very much against the Celtic spirituality of Iona, where they're protecting because they saw the goodness in everything. They would have wanted to keep that. And unfortunately, we don't have that history in places like St. Giles, Iona, Glasgow Cathedral, because they were all destroyed. In Istanbul, the Hagia Sophia, it's been a church, a mosque, a museum, and now it's a mosque again. They've done a great job. The Muslims didn't destroy all the Christian imagery when they took it over. They kept it. So you can see actually some Greek mythology things in there. And you can see Christian frescoes. And you see the script of the Islamic Quran throughout there as well. And everything's kind of there together, existing in kind of place, instead of wiping that historic building apart and just putting up new things, which they did during the Scottish Reformation. They were so against the icons and everything. And that's why for early in church, even in the U.S., you had Presbyterian churches were little white clapboard churches with nothing in them at all. Because they were so big on, we can't have images of the Bible, images of God, anything that could be seen as an icon. Eventually we get away from that, which is why we have stained glass windows now. But everything with the Puritans and all that was very just stark, nothing. And so you lose a lot of that history, sadly, throughout Scotland because of that Reformation time. All right, so Loch Lomond. Here is Loch Lomond. It was created in the last ice age when 3 or 4 lochs with completely different geologies merged into one expanse of water that's now called Loch Lomond. That's why it's so varied and beautiful. You get these different geologies and features now become one big loch or lake. Loch Lomond was originally named Loch Lennox or even Loch Leven. The Dukes of Lennox were the main landholders here. Its new name may come from the Gaelic Laimon, meaning Lake of Elms, or it may originate from Laom, meaning beacon, referring to the nearby mountain Ben Lomond. Loch Lomond is the largest lake by surface area in Great Britain, and the second largest by volume in Great Britain after Loch Ness. There's about 5 lakes in Great Britain that all have the largest something. So either the deepest, or the most water, or the longest. Each one has a lake. They claim something. In the early 8th century, an Irish missionary named St. Kentigern settled on an Inch Cailleach. Inch kind of means island, an island on Loch Lomond. Legend has it that she set up a nunnery there. Then also there's the outlaw and folk hero Rob Roy McGregor. Was it local? So you have some of those legends. If you saw the old Rob Roy movie with Liam Neeson, that stuff would have happened along Loch Lomond. And then, of course, there's a song a few people know, The Bonny Banks of Loch Lomond. First published in 1841. Well, you'll take the high road, and I'll take the low road, and I'll be in Scotland for you. Many think of it as a romantic song, but the lyrics actually relate to the Jacobite Rising of 1745, the last in a series of bloody revolts against the British throne. And if you listen to all the words, it's not a happy song. So it's not a John, everyone's going to be in Scotland. No, you're all going to die. So that's Loch Lomond. Now we're going to go to a little town called Luss there. Beautiful little town, lots of little cottages with roses on it, and there's a pier. We'll take a boat ride someplace around Loch Lomond. Now, unfortunately, the best smoked seafood place in Scotland has closed its doors in Luss, so you don't get to buy smoked trout and smoked salmon. It had a nice little cafe that was really good too. It also has since closed, so sorry. But it's a beautiful town, and you'll take a boat ride out on the loch, and you'll see these different islands, and they have the Highland cattle there. That's the woolly cows with the orange red hair down in front of their eyes. They're pretty cool. So from there we go to Glasgow. That's the town of Luss right there, with this little pier you get on boat rides. All that. So this is Glasgow. So this little curved bridge here. When we stayed in this apartment building right there by the curved bridge, and it lights up at night. Because I remember we arrived there, my daughter was so off her time. I was like walking her around her stroller at 1 a.m. trying to get her to fall asleep. So I walked past that bridge a lot. She did not fall asleep. So Glasgow was probably founded in the 6th century when St. Mungo built a church at a place called Glasgow. It means green place. A fishing settlement at the green place eventually grew into a small town. The beginnings of medieval Glasgow started around 1119 with the building of the cathedral on the site of St. Kentigern's first church. St. Kentigern is the same person as St. Mungo. They like to have different names just to confuse everybody. So medieval Glasgow ran from the River Clyde up through the Salt Market, along the High Street up to the cathedral. So the medieval landscape of buildings such as the Bishop's Castle and all of that are now like hidden beneath the Victorian architecture. There's not a lot of that really old city left. The only thing really remaining of the medieval architecture is Glasgow Cathedral, Crookston Castle, Providence Lordship, Providence Hall, Tolbooth Steeple, that kind of stuff. So the cathedral was kind of the only medieval cathedral in Scottish mainland to have survived the Protestant Reformation, pretty much virtually intact. So if you want to kind of see what they used to look like, Glasgow Cathedral didn't get as kind of broken up and bombed out and just destroyed like St. Giles did. So you'll still see some Catholic imagery in Glasgow Cathedral. Cathedral dates from 1200s, dedicated to St. Mungo, St. Kentigern. You can read more about it, some different stuff. It had things fall apart, things rebuilt. The exterior is pretty austere, but the inside is really a beautiful vaulted roof, soars 105 feet. You can see the entire 285-foot length of the building when you kind of stand at the front and just kind of see it all across. And you can learn a lot about its history there. Here's Glasgow Cathedral. It looks like a lot of other cathedrals. So this is the necropolis. So the day, our full day in Glasgow, we'll have a morning tour of the cathedral, and then you're pretty much free the rest of the day. The necropolis is just right on a hill above the cathedral. It's well worth just kind of walking up there. There's a big statue, monument dedicated to John Knox overlooking it. There's a lot of old Celtic crosses. Some interesting people are buried there, but it's not a super old cemetery. It's more of a Victorian cemetery, but it's still worth kind of a pop up. It's a little bit of a walk up the hill. Some other things. So Glasgow isn't, that's Robert, we'll get there in a second. Glasgow isn't like the coolest city, I would say, in Scotland, but there's some cool things to do there. There's a couple interesting museums. If you like botanic gardens, the Glasgow Botanical Garden is really nice, and it's not too hard to get from there. Also, sometimes just walking around that downtown area can be nice. I'll probably go to this little museum, placed in this larger grand park that has a lot of art from Scotland and also historical things, then go to the Botanic Gardens, and then go to my favorite restaurant in Scotland. There's 2 locations in Glasgow, 2 locations in Edinburgh. It's called Cafe Andalus, and it has good Andalusian food, but everything's marked like gluten-free and vegan and other stuff. So if you have food allergies, it's the place to go. And it's delicious. So that's Glasgow. Any questions on Glasgow? It's more of the industrial town. Kind of think Edinburgh's Philadelphia, Pittsburgh's Glasgow. That makes sense? Both are cool, but they're different. So the next day we start heading towards Ireland, but we stop in the Ayrshire area with the Robert Burns Birthplace Museum. So Robert Burns was born in Alloway, where this is, on January 25th, 1759. So there's, you can actually go to like his little birthplace house. Obviously they've done a lot of rework on it because it's old and it was thatched roof, so it's not the same thatched roof. But it has a good museum that has stuff about Robert Burns. Also, there's a nice gift shop where you can get your Robert Burns memorabilia. Courtney has a mug from there, as she has from most places we've gone. It's a nice mug. You can read more about Robert Burns. One of the interesting things, though, about the Robert Burns Birthplace Museum is you'll go in the house and you'll see where they kept the animals in one of the main rooms during the winter and the manger there, which ties back to what we talk about on Christmas Eve, where Jesus was probably actually born in a house where they had animals and put him in the manger that was in the house. This happened all the way back in Jesus' day up to Robert Burns' day. You'll see the little cow garage as part of the house. Yeah, and you can see the little like Tammany Bridge or whatever, all of that. So that then kind of ends our tour of Scotland. We take then a ferry across Scotland over to Ireland and Belfast. So some of the main free time after the Edinburgh Castle on the Saturday we arrive, you have free time in Edinburgh. There's a couple key things to do. I'm not sure where the bus for the tour group leaves us, maybe at Edinburgh Castle. But right down, if you just walk down that main road, the Royal Mile, there's tons of textile shops, gift shops. There's also something called the Whiskey Experience. Highly recommend the Whiskey Experience. It was Verity's favorite part when she was 2. Not sure what that says. When she was 3, we have a Scottish alphabet book, and when people say W is for, she would say whiskey. But it's in the book. It's in the book. W is for whiskey in a Scottish alphabet book. But the Whiskey Experience is more than just whiskey. You get it's kind of like the Hershey Chocolate World. You get in a giant barrel, and they kind of take you along and show how whiskey is made, just like the Hershey ride takes you Scotch's chocolate's made. But you get to try some scotch at the end if you like to, all that good stuff. But if you don't want to have to go to a whole distillery, you can kind of learn the basics of scotch there. You can go all the way down that road, and at the very end of the road, that's Holyrood Palace. Also good to get in. If you want to do that, you might want to get tickets kind of ahead of time for a timed entry, because everything is timed entry now. So it's hard to decide on the last minute, oh, I want to go to Holyrood. There's going to be lines. You probably need to say, I want to do that. Maybe we can send out an email if a group wants to go. They can all go at the same time and not go on their own. A couple really nice museums there in Edinburgh with Scottish history and all of that. Another interesting place to go is a place called Inchcolm Island. It's an island that has a little abbey on it. kind of in the Firth of Forth there. So you take a boat ride from right beyond the Forth Bridge, that big red railroad bridge. You go under the bridge. You can often see seals and dolphins in the water. But you go to this island that was a site of an old monastery, but also had World War I guns set up to protect Edinburgh and the Forth. In April, it's going to be a little cold, maybe a little rocky. We went in June and it was a little cold.
Yeah, I was just going to say, they call Inchcolm the Iona of the East.
So like when we went, we kind of actually enjoyed it more than Iona in some ways. It kind of felt more like that thin place. So Iona's called a thin place, kind of where the veil between earth and heaven is a little bit thinner. You kind of get that sense of the divine there. Inchcolm kind of had that feel. It's more private. Often you're the only ones there with the boat that kind of takes you out there. So it's a really cool place. It's another option to potentially be able to do on Edinburgh. Then a few people are going to go to St. Andrews and play golf. Our hotel's right near Waverley Station, so it'll be easy to grab that train up to St. Andrews.
Stephen, we'll have some time on our arrival day too, for those people who, like me, stay up. I never sleep when I get there.
Me neither.
But the yacht Britannia is also.
I know Tom Davis plans to walk over to the yacht Britannia, right, Tom?
Well, I don't know if it's long.
He wants to walk. It's not too bad. You go through Leith. So there's that yacht Britannia. It's really nice. The Edinburgh Botanical Gardens are really nice. And honestly, sometimes my favorite thing is just walking around the streets, popping into a pub. You can find and play pub trivia. Courtney and I won a pub trivia competition in Edinburgh. She has a shirt to prove it. So it's kind of just fun to walk around, find a pub, sit around, talk to locals, kind of experience. You can go to the Walter Scott Monument, climb to the top of that. I'll be going to the grocery store Sainsbury's on our first night. You have to go a little bit outside the city to get to the big ones. But if you want to be able to get snacks and things for the day, especially if you have any allergens, they have a really great free-from section with delicious fruit tarts and all kinds of baked tarts. But I'll go and stock up for the rest of the trip. They have little local Sainsbury's if you don't need to do all the allergy stuff. But sometimes on lunches you don't always get a huge lunch or it's quick. It's always good to have a few snacks in your bag. So if anybody needs to go to Sainsbury's, I'll take an Uber there and I'll get a bunch of stuff. Questions about the history of Scotland? Or an overview of any of the places we're going to go or anything we're going to do? Questions about the trip in general, options, that kind of stuff? Yes, Mary.
I'm wondering, when John Knox preached, how long was this kind of service at that time?
I mean, they're long. Again, we don't have too many of his published sermons, but they're not going to be the little 10-minute treats. Think like John Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, that length. Mm-hmm. It can easily be 40 to 45-minute sermon. Mm-hmm. So y'all think I go long sometimes. Yeah, so they're going to be a longer bit there because they have to rail against the Catholic Queen, and you can't do that in 5 minutes. You can't get all your insults out.
So yeah, I was just going to pop in there and just note that we're a very visual society, and they were much more of an oral society. So even as recently as the Lincoln-Douglas debates, say, you were really judged by your ability to speak for a long period of time, for 3 hours sometimes. So, for example, when Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, people were not real impressed with it at the time, because it was this short little 2-minute thing, and that's really impressive to us because for us, it's how concise can you be? Can you get it down to 140 characters or whatever? Sue's smiling over there. She's like, yes. But for them, it was really it wasn't necessarily a hardship to sit and listen to something for 3 hours because, again, they didn't have, not to say they didn't have anything else to do, but they didn't have the various kinds of entertainment content that we have today. So in some ways, that's kind of like kind of is like an entertaining thing to go and listen. Like everybody else who spoke at Gettysburg spoke for like 2 or 3 hours, and Lincoln just kind of popped up there and said something real quick. And of course, like, we like that now. We're like, nobody remembers who else spoke at Gettysburg, but.
Yes, this is the Robert Burns Birthplace House. You'll get to see later. Any other questions? Alrighty, so in 2 weeks on March 10th, we'll be back in here and we'll kind of go through the history of the Troubles. And I'll have a lot of little videos from the British Imperial War Museum where they kind of show you things and talk through some of the different key aspect points of that, because we'll get to learn more about that for those who wanted to sign up for the walking tour in Belfast. And of course, we'll learn a lot more about it in Derry as well. Those are two kind of key centers. And at Corrymeela, they were working to try to bring some of these people who were key leaders on both sides together. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.